Welcome to this webinar, How to Fund the Decarbonisation of Your Building Portfolio, which has been held by Building in association with Atkins and Faithful Gould. I am Thomas Lane, the Technical Editor of Building Magazine. The big challenge facing developers is decarbonising their existing portfolio. The reason is that 80% of the buildings that will be around in 2050 are already standing today. Decarbonising existing buildings is a big challenge because it is much more expensive than the over cost of making new buildings net zero. It is also very disruptive too, particularly if a building is leased. In this session, we will explore how to establish a business case to fund the decarbonisation of a large building portfolio. We will look at how industry firms can support setting up the business case from the cost management and engineering perspectives, what this means for asset holders, and how to go about securing the financing once a business case is in place. I am joined by Dr. Miguel Godfrey, the Head of Sustainability at the Government Property Agency, Stuart McLaren, Director for Net Zero Infrastructure at Atkins, Annabelle Clark, the Regional Director for Engineering Services at Faithful Gould, and Rob Miller, the Sustainability Manager at Argent. So the format of today's session will be that each panelist will speak for about 8 minutes, and once all the formal presentations are finished, we will take questions from the audience. That's you. So if there's anything you want to ask our experts, please just type it into your browser and click send, and then we'll endeavour to answer as many of these as possible at the end. So our panelists are going to cover the following topics. So Miguel will talk about the challenge facing the Government Property Agency, including financing retrofit. Stuart will discuss how data plays a role in decarbonisation. Annabelle will look at available funding and how these can be accessed. And finally, Rob will offer a private sector perspective on the challenge with reference to King's Cross development. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Miguel Godfrey at the Government Property Agency. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, Thomas. Could I have the first slide, please? So I thought I'd give you an overview of the Government Property Agency's approach to net zero. If we could go back a slide. So the rationale is to focus initially on our clients, that's our government departments, particularly providing the data that they need for their greening government commitments reporting, setting rigorous targets, aligning with the UK's net zero strategy, complying with legislation, setting out our procurement so that we know that we have a sustainable supply chain, reducing energy, water, and minimizing waste, particularly that to landfill, and increasing our recycling, composting, and reuse. In operation, having sustainable operation of our assets after delivery, putting in place the governance to make sure that net zero happens, and rationalizing the current office estate of over 800 legacy assets to 423 sustainable assets by 2030. And our approach to this is to set rigorous standards and targets, to put in place the governance and projects needed to make that transformation happen, and to increase our capacity and capability so that we're an intelligent client service for sustainability. Our analysis focuses around these 6 areas of water, waste, energy, biodiversity, climate resilience, and sustainability. And our enablers for that and our management of that are through our governance, through our behavioural changes as an organisation, through our management systems, and our data. The key outputs that we're focusing on at present is getting in place a rigorous sustainability reporting tool for how we're doing, putting in place ISO 14001 across the government office portfolio, having a rigorous program of net zero interventions, including EV charging points, switching, where possible, all of our onboarded estates to renewable energy guarantees origin, putting in place sustainable procurement of all of our services and contracts and also leases, and putting in place the business case for our 10 major strategic recommendations on sustainability that will have an impact on the overarching portfolio. The next slide, please. So the government has set out its stall and a timeline for attaining net zero, and the ambition within Government Property Agency is to better those. We want to reduce our Scope 1 emissions by 50% ahead of the government 2032 target by 2037. We want to cut our direct emissions by 78% by 2035, which is ahead of the government target of 75% by 2037. And we want to reduce our overall office emissions to net zero ahead of the 2050 government target. And in order to help us do that, we have defined what net zero and the performance of our property should be in our workplace design guide. We have a net zero and sustainability annex to our design guide, which informs contractors the work that they ought to do to achieve our maximum targets. And we have a sustainability plan, which is the plan of how we intend to operate our assets once we have made them net zero. The next slide, please. Key to all of this and our current focus is having rigorous monitoring in place. We have worked with outside contractors to develop a key monitoring process that allows us to see when we have achieved good. Now, good is compliance with the government buying standard, which means that all of our refurbishments are at BREEAM 2014 very good, and all of our new builds are BREEAM 2018 excellent. That's what good looks like. Leading edge is compliance with our design guide, and if you fully comply with our design guide, you will have a net zero building. So our monitoring focuses on a guide to all of the work that we're currently doing, our client reporting, which is so that we can feed that into their greening government commitment reporting, GPA reporting, i.e. within the whole of the government office portfolio, so that at any point in time, we can tell you the carbon status of the whole of our government office portfolio, and our net zero reporting, which provides the evidence base for the benefits realization of all of the interventions in our net zero program to demonstrate their value for money. The challenges we faced in doing that are building the tool itself, which has proven to be quite an expensive and a long process, integrating our existing data into a common data feed for our tool, engaging with our clients and showing them a working prototype so that they can see that the tool works properly and answers their questions, integrating all existing live data feeds so that at any point in time we can see the actual live status of our assets, and aligning all of our FM provision, because some clients, i.e. departments, may outsource their FM provision, but all of that FM provision needs to feed its data into a common source. So we need contractual arrangements to ensure that all of these data that we need to feed our tool is sourced and is fed frequently and regularly into the system. The last slide, please, and this is really the funding challenge. Next slide, please. We seem to have cut off the top end, but that's okay. We cannot do this alone by offsets or our OPEX, simply because in the government green government commitments, there is no provision for offsetting, so there's no benefit to offsetting at the moment. And also, that we want to remove all perverse incentives for people not to stretch the boundaries and decarbonize their assets as much as possible. We know that if we go for the minimum government buying standard of BREEAM very good or BREEAM excellent, we are not going to meet our 2027 target, so we need to be doing more. Rather than just going for the BREEAM credits or using something like design for performance, we need to be focusing on those credits which add most to our decarbonisation credentials. So rather than just cherry picking the credits that you need to get that minimum standards, you need to be focusing also on those which add to decarbonisation. What is clear is that there needs to be a capex uplift to go beyond the minimum standard that you need to achieve at the moment, and to do the additional interventions which is in our net zero program to allow us to, by 2050, achieve our net zero standard. So in an awful lot of the programs that we currently have in play, which initially have set out to meet the government minimum standards and the building regulations minimum standards, we are working with them and introducing them to our design guide to, where possible, introduce additional efficiencies and value engineer into that what uplift we need in our spend, because it's quite clear that if we minimize our spend to the absolute minimum, we may meet those minimum government buying standards, but we will not achieve our goal. So the big challenge is working with our existing clients and contractors to building that additional value add without bursting our budgets. Thank you. That's my introduction.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed for that, Miguel. Just a quick question for you before we move on to our presentation. I mean, you've got a lot of buildings to tackle. Is there any particular sort of type of building that you're going to tackle first, or sort of any particular age, or is it going to be done regionally or some other way?
Yeah, I mean, so the main focus at the moment is the Hubs program, whereby we are building state-of-the-art, purpose-built buildings to move as many people as we can out of the old, dilapidated legacy estate and into fit-for-purpose buildings right across the UK. It's all part of the levelling up agenda, whereby we're building strategically hubs all around the UK so that we can house civil servants within them. And then we have to work out what we will do with those parts of the legacy estate that we know that we will be maintaining beyond 2030.
Right, I see. And I guess if you're decanting people, it's a bit easier to tackle those buildings which have been vacated when it comes to, refurbishment.
It is, but I guess it begs the major question is that we have a number of our buildings which are a historical estate, and the legacy buildings around Whitehall, which we know will always be a delta because we don't believe that the end performance is going to be absolutely net zero. So there are areas of the estate where we have to do better to offset some of that lack of performance.
I see. Yeah, understood. Well, brilliant. Well, thanks very much indeed, Miguel. So I'm going to move on now to our next presentation. It's going to be Stuart McNally, who is the Director of Net Zero Infrastructure at Atkins. So over to you, Stuart.
Excellent. All right, let me just see if I can work the technology. I'll share my slides. There we go. Let me know if you can see that.
Yeah, I can see you might. Oh, that's it. Perfect. Yeah, it's all there.
All good. Cool. Well, I thought I'd just take the opportunity then to bring this back to a wider picture and looking at some of the major trends that are unfolding in which the decarbonisation of the built environment exists within. And the decarbonisation of building doesn't exist in isolation. It's a journey that unfolds within a wider system of decarbonisation activities across all the system components within the urban environment. And I think it's probably worth just mentioning that, from a funding perspective, there are potentially a much wider range of opportunities to source financing to support decarbonisation, depending on the size and complexity of an estate and its operations and how it might link in with those wider components. And I think Annabelle might touch on some of those wider funding opportunities later in this webinar. But over the last 20 years, there's been a growing push to refit established and build smart, new and low carbon cities and large urban areas. And this transition from our sort of patchy state today to interconnected and dynamic cities of the future, where data maturity is high, enabling automated and responsive urban environments, is arguably moving a lot slower than we need it to. And there are multiple reasons for this. But first and most daunting of all the challenges, whether you're at a city scale or at an estate level, is where do you start and can you fund the change? And what quickly follows is, do you have the information and the data needed to actually identify, develop and deliver the solutions? And can you make the investment case to progress them with confidence? And successfully de-risking decision making, especially where decarbonisation journeys for moderate and large portfolios can take years, if not decades, will be contingent on having sort of high data maturity from as early in your journey as is possible. This is particularly true when you start considering the pace of technology development and their associated costs, rapidly shifting energy markets, volatile supply chain costs, and the impacts those factors are going to have on your investment case, as well as the ongoing long-term delivery program that you embark on. So I guess the key message I'm trying to get across is data in all the forms, whether it's asset data, cost data, carbon data, is going to be critical on the journey to decarbonising the built environment. And the information and data that you need to identify, develop and deliver the various systems, solutions and interventions are going to broadly be the same information and data that you need to build your business and investment case to secure the finance needed to fund your journey to net zero. So whether you're securing finance or funding internally or seeking it externally from various funds or investors, your business case will need a detailed and accurate view of your decarbonisation plan and the whole life impacts that those interventions will have in terms of economic returns, as well as any carbon abatement, amongst various other things. And so while I strongly advocate for data-driven solutions to be a focus for helping organisations help de-risk their journey through informed investment decision making, data maturity is all too often poor. And actually, without good data, even the smartest data-driven solutions will underperform. And getting good data can actually be really quite challenging. It can be timely and it can be costly. And this is something we've paid really close attention to as we've developed our own decarbonomics service platform. And broadly, there are sort of three key areas where data can be sourced and is typically used to support the decarbonisation journey and help secure funding and finance. And these can come from building management systems, sensors and the like, physical building surveys, actually visiting buildings and undertaking surveys across an estate, and accessing information through open source benchmark databases and so on. Each of those come with varying costs and provide different levels of accuracy and output. This is important because the accuracy of your outputs, whether it's a benchmark or a costed roadmap, can have a material impact on the viability of your investment case, your business case, or your funding application. For instance, being able to understand your cost per tonne of carbon saved by intervention at both the building and portfolio level could be critical to informing whether you can qualify for certain funding routes. So for instance, if you are above a funding threshold, what are the levers you can pull in terms of intervention modelling to make an application stack up and likely to succeed? And this means taking a systems-based approach. And taking a systems-based approach should provide you the greatest chance of securing the finance needed and ensuring that you're actually able to optimize delivery in the long run through continuous improvement, proactively closing costly performance gaps that may emerge over time and actually potentially even threaten any long-term financing or funding arrangements that you've actually got in place. And the ability to move forward with system-based thinking also provides much greater performance opportunities, such as establishing the standardization of data standards that you can flow through the supply chain and actually support the establishment and tracking of KPIs and other incentivization approaches. And when we're looking at our own decarbonomics offering that we've been developing over the last year, one of the key drivers has been at how we can more accurately benchmark an organization's estate with as little building survey data as is possible and still deliver robust and highly accurate outputs. The mission is helping clients understand when enough data is enough, minimizing upfront costs and shrinking pre-delivery program durations, and enable them to move to delivery as quickly and as efficiently as possible without compromising on long-term delivery performance. The more data you have or have access to, such as open source benchmarks, which are becoming increasingly available, the more powerful data-driven solutions will be. But data alone is just the fuel. You still need the engine. And in this case, that engine is the intelligent analytics, the algorithms, AI, machine learning that we're applying to that data to provide the robust and accurate outputs that can be visualized and interrogated by a diverse mix of users, whether you're within technical delivery teams or whether you're the investment case or finance leads. And while I've just spoken about data, the true power of smart data-driven solutions is how they combine the best of people, expertise, with data and technology. Because no matter how much clever digital and data systems we apply to these problems, human beings will always be needed to drive the system and guide the outputs. So that was just my overview of sort of really trying to emphasize the passion we have at how important data is, but it's a key ingredient into this mission. Thank you.
Great, well, thanks very much indeed, Stuart, for that. Again, I've got a quick question for you, sort of going forward. I mean, to understand the portfolio, must be quite a big job. I mean, how does it take presumably years to harness all the data that you would need to kind of come up with a decarbonisation strategy? Because you have to at least a year, wouldn't you? Because you need a heating and a cooling cycle, or can you do it more quick?
Absolutely. So I think, you know, if you look at traditional models and how sort of data gets acquired, depending on the size of the estate, you know, if you've got hundreds of buildings or thousands of buildings, as I said in my presentation just now, often data maturity is actually what we see is often, not always, but often pretty poor. And when clients look at what they need to do to get themselves to a point of maturity where they can start to develop a clear plan and actually understand where they are today and what they might want to do into the future, it can take months, if not years, and it can be very expensive. If you've got high degrees of building surveys needing to be done for hundreds, if not thousands of buildings, it's broadly impractical. And often what we see is our clients struggle to even justify the investment to go get the information, let alone turn that into a plan to go and justify the investment for the interventions, which is why we've been really focused on, okay, when is enough data enough, and how can you actually get high degrees of accuracy through benchmarking, and actually have a more tailored approach between a much lower degree of surveying with much more powerful benchmarking and the analytics that allows you to sort of understand how accurate you are against the different typologies to give the client confidence that they can move forward quicker. So there are ways in which you can do this, and it's not just us that are looking at this. You know, I think the whole industry is looking at this because the demand is there to enable people to move forward quicker and with greater confidence. But it can be challenging, which is why having a really mature approach to data is really important.
Sure. Great, well, thanks very much indeed for that, Stuart. So we're now going to move on to our next presentation. It's Annabelle Clark, who is the Regional Director for Engineering Services at Faithful Gould. So
Brilliant. Have my slides popped up?
yes, they have, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I wanted to start today, obviously on the topic of how to fund the decarbonisation journey that everyone is facing as a huge challenge. And I thought I'd start with what's stopping everyone from acting. The latest IPCC report that covered climate change impacts, vulnerability and adaptation suggested that any further delay in concerted global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. We all know this. Everyone listened in to COP26 in Glasgow last year, and it made it very clear that the onus is on us to make a change, and specifically to decarbonise our existing buildings as well. We know what to do in a lot of instances, so switching rapidly to clean energy, transitioning to low carbon materials, and running those buildings more sustainably. But the big challenge that you can see here, these kind of 5 key reasons that people aren't acting, are cost, risk, innovation and availability, stakeholder engagement, and data design and understanding. And as we heard from Stuart in the presentation before, data is an absolutely huge one for people understanding where their carbon is coming from. But risk, innovation and availability, stakeholder engagement, and the data side are all also pushing up cost, because where there is risk, you have additional cost. And so cost is one of the biggest reasons that's stopping everyone from starting right now. I guess climate finance, alongside most cost, is notoriously tricky to define. The CLC said that it will take £500 billion. Savills said it will take 330 billion, so there is discrepancy even there. But of the cost needed just to retrofit the UK's 29 million homes, and what comes from that in terms of energy efficiency improvements. And the big question that everyone is asking is, where does this money come from? I guess the plan is that private investment will provide most of the financing required to commercialise these early technologies and scale low carbon sectors. But public finance provides that early investment, interventions, and really clear signalling, as we heard from Miguel in the first presentation, that will create the conditions for that accelerated net zero carbon investment. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan that was delivered in 2020 set out an ambitious green industrial revolution. It mobilised £12 billion of government investment to create and support up to 250,000 green jobs and spur as much as 3 times more private sector investment by 2030. And I think it's fair to say we're really seeing a shift in the industry. We need more and more people to move into this space, to innovate and to deliver the low carbon solutions that we're looking at. Adequate financing is really key to progress in decarbonisation and zero carbon developments, yet quite often we lack awareness of what those upcoming opportunities are. And it's one of the main obstacles that prevent public institutions from accessing this funding. I guess put simply, many of us just don't know where to find that funding, what the requirements are. There isn't a simple framework that you can go to find out which one to access. There are lots and lots of available funds, and I've pulled out a selection on the screen here in front of us, particularly those that are most relevant to the built environment. And there's a huge range of different funding. You know, if you take the Low Carbon Skills Fund, this is very much set up to prepare organisations for the public sector decarbonisation scheme. So going back to Stuart's challenge around the data, making sure that that data is all set up, you've got it ready to go, so that then as soon as a funding portal becomes available, you're ready there to submit and access that funding. But there are other constraints, such as Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. You know, the minimum application there is £1 million. So you actually have to look at this on quite a large scale to access that funding. But what's brilliant to see in that one is that, you know, really driving the fabric first approach, which with fuel poverty and rising utility costs, as have been mentioned, absolutely key to part of this decarbonisation journey. And just recently, in the spring statement, we heard that there is now a reduced rate on VAT, so it's moved from the 5% to 0% on energy saving products, so such as insulation, heat pumps and solar panels. So loads of fantastic movements. And also in the innovation space, you know, where you've got the Heat Pump Ready programme, a programme looking at what is the best solution. Are heat pumps our best solution? You know, putting pilot schemes in place through funding so that we have that data at our fingertips. But as we've said, to be able to actually access that funding, you need the data in place. You need it ready to go as soon as that portal opens, particularly because the majority of them are based on a first come, first served process. And so as part of our Faithful Gould, Atkins and SNC Lavalin proposition around decarbonisation, we've been working on a platform called Decarbonomics. The biggest challenge is often where to start. And so what Decarbonomics gives you is a really simple 3-stage process of benchmark, roadmap and deliver that you see in front of you. Benchmark is developing a carbon baseline. It's providing access to real data and also benchmark data to provide an overview of the best solution, the best cost and program solution to getting to a net zero carbon estate. In the roadmap stage, it's designing a cost-effective carbon reduction pathway, looking at funding opportunities alongside that, and presenting a business case to actually move into the deliver stage for net zero carbon. And finally, implementing those carbon reduction solutions on site. So from building retrofit to behaviour change, and then also measuring the progress across the portfolio and asset lifecycle. In that section, it's really key that we're looking at procurement of local skills and delivery, and what the best delivery route is. For instance, for LED interventions, is it looking at your existing facilities managers? But then with slightly larger interventions, such as PV or renewables, making sure that you've got those procurement routes in place and you can secure the funding early on. Absolutely key in this step is also measurement and verification. So looking at that return on investment. Are we actually seeing the kilowatt hour savings that we expected? Are the costs what we expected in a hugely volatile market at the moment? And at Faithful and Gould, in our QS community, we're absolutely looking at those, where that funding can take place. So when we're pulling together a cost plan, looking at providing access to funding routes where they are available. And in our PM community, building the application in as part of that design process through the retrofit. So thinking from upfront, what are the low regret measures, the worst performing buildings, the ones where we can get best value for money that are built into all of our standard processes. I think it's pretty key that there is no one size fits all to decarbonisation, and the installations and adaptations needed will vary across sectors, across estates, and building by building. And so quite often, a good model to look at is in the application of applying for funding, looking at conducting pilot projects and monitoring the effects of those through measurement and verification to see what will best suit your specific needs, and look at those innovations and experimentation to deliver the best business case possible. And also looking at this alongside wider value. So I guess reframing capital cost in terms of whole life value, looking at it across the whole life of the asset and bringing in additional net zero benefits and opportunities. Thinking outside of just carbon, thinking about that staff attraction and retention in the buildings that we might be office buildings looking to retrofit, or with housing. Houses that people want to live in and actually have lower energy bills, tackling some of that fuel poverty. Looking at increased market value and social benefits that come from that in terms of healthier and more comfortable buildings. And the last message I wanted to leave you with was kind of unlocking the delivery of net zero carbon through the decarbonomics process. How do you go about that? It's absolutely key that you identify experienced delivery partners who can help support with access to the funding, keeping an eye on the portals, both private and public sector investment, and can alert you to that, and make sure within that you upskill staff that are working on the project, those who are operating assets, also those that are delivering works within the building, so making sure buildings are being operated as efficiently as possible, so reduce actually the resource and energy use that you're seeing in that building above all. Verify those net zero outcomes, making sure that you really are putting in the best interventions for your estate and that you're getting that return on investment out of it. Allow enough time. I think, with the funding, the applications come online very fast. And so actually making sure you've got that oven-ready solution that you can submit as soon as the portal opens is absolutely key. You've got that data to hand and can submit it. Focusing on whole life value, we've touched on. So I think, thinking in a business case around the social, economic and environmental implications of the decarbonisation process. And above all, prioritising the environment within that. But I think the key message really is that to fund decarbonisation, it is a large cost, and it's going to take organisations many years to put that funding in the appropriate places. So the right time to start is to start now. Thank
Great.
you, Thomas.
Annabelle. Quick question for you. I mean, I think it was your second slide where you had a showing the different funding streams available. I mean, how much of that would be available to the commercial development community? Or is that mostly sort of social housing and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the ones that I've got up on the screen here that you can see are all, well, the majority of these are for public sector. So I think one of those key messages there is around, you know, the fact that the government want to show that they are investing early, providing the scale of the challenge, looking at what the solutions are, so that there is then private sector investment to take that forward. But what you can see here is in the majority open to the public sector to make sure that things are started now, but particularly with the innovation pieces. So where you've got the flexibility innovation programme, the heat pump ready programme, of course, all of the outputs from that are going to be absolutely key for all sectors to take forward as well.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thanks very much, Annabelle. We're now going to move on to our last presenter, Rob Miller, who's the Sustainability Manager at Argent, who's going to talk about King's Cross development. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Thomas. I don't have a presentation, which I'm regretting now because it's a bit unnerving just seeing your own face for 8 minutes, but I'll do my best. And it's been really interesting to listen to the presentations. Hopefully I can relate to a lot of those principles in practice, I think. So I'll try and touch on those as we go through. But yeah, so I'm the Sustainability Manager for the King's Cross estate on behalf of Argent. And I'm just going to talk as quickly as I can within 8 minutes about the journey that King's Cross has been on to date with regard to carbon performance and how we're looking to continue that journey to what is hopefully net zero position. Just really quickly, the context. King's Cross is about a 67-acre estate in London. It's home to about 50 new and repurposed buildings. It's built with a big heritage, a number of heritage assets on the estate that have been repurposed, and made up of a range of different building functions. So a number of commercial offices, about 1,700 homes, big retail provision, things like Cold Drops Yard, and a lot of leisure facilities as well. So this is all supported again by a diverse public realm, parks, pedestrianised streets and squares, and things like Granary Square with the sort of fountains at its centre. King's Cross has always been aimed to be a destination that allows people to flourish, and things like sustainability and ESG have been embedded in its DNA from the outset, and this is referenced a little bit through some of the really early design decisions. So things like developing the site-wide heat network, combining the Empower, and developing several BREEAM outstanding buildings. I think that's more than any other destination in the UK. So it continues to be a driving factor as the estate evolves, and this is illustrated, I think, also by the quality of the new buildings that continue to be developed, but also through delivering carbon neutrality for the estate, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. We're also really fortunate, in a really positive position, to have some really proactive and really positive tenants on the estate. So people such as Google or Meta or Havas and others that have really ambitious ESG targets, which makes that collaborative piece much easier. So working with them is a really key part of that ongoing strategy for estate decarbonisation to move towards net zero. And I think from the outset, while there's a really significant engineering response and of course an associated cost implication, delivering a net zero estate is very much about having a really effective comms strategy and working really openly and collaboratively with all of your stakeholders, be that investors or tenants or any others that we're active, and that's what we're actively trying to deliver, especially in the sort of post-COVID environment now. So just, I mentioned we become carbon neutral, so I'll just touch a little bit on that and then talk about where we're going forward from there. So that was announced in November last year, was certified by a third party, and there are a range of factors that have contributed to that journey. So the historic emissions, the starting point, were offset. So all the embodied and operational carbon emissions through using verified carbon offsets. And then the site also now has 100% renewable supplies to the estate, so focusing on that green energy. So we have a green gas supply from an anaerobic digestion facility and a REGO-backed tariff from our energy supplier. And it's worth noting on both of those examples, the ambition is to improve the quality of that procurement over time. So, for example, we signed heads of terms for a PPA to support the development of additional renewable supply in the UK, and we would take 100% of that supply from a new renewable source. So we've offset those historic emissions, but we've also we've got the renewable energy supply, but the development is still ongoing. So there are still a number of plots still in development. So we need to have an evolving offset or carbon reduction strategy in place. And for all new and future buildings at King's Cross, that embodied carbon will be offset through sequestering carbon as part of a number of forestry projects. And this will also account for the refurbishment works for any landscape improvements or refurbishment of the buildings within the estate as well. So that's a long-term project through land that we've purchased for forestry as well. And then just before talking about future decarbonisation, I just want to touch on, it's worth noting, I think, that King's Cross has utilised green finance options for a number of plots, historically and more recently, and that's most recently for development of plot R8, which is being developed with in partnership with the Office Group. And just making sure that, to qualify as a green loan, it meets the Loan Market Association's green loan principles. And as a headline, that building will be designed to deliver net zero performance, so it'll be integrated into the base build. And then will also be, I think, the 8th BREEAM outstanding building on the estate. And I think using that green finance approach from a private perspective has the benefits to the borrower in terms of that potentially improved interest rate, and demonstrates that commitment to ESG by integrating it into the finance function. I think that's also an increasing view that companies with a strong ESG strategy might be seen as better borrowers from a risk perspective as well, from a credit risk perspective. So just then lastly, I don't know I've got loads of time, but in terms of moving to net zero and our approach to take that forward, which is now probably a challenge of improving energy efficiency and just building on some of those points around data as well. There are some key points that we're currently working through that really need to be addressed to allow the development of a really robust engineering and cost response to that future pathway. And the first is the definition. I think we've come quite a long way in the last few years about what that looks like, but I don't think we're totally there yet in the whole industry having an agreed definition of what net zero is necessarily. A lot of people use a lot of very similar language. I think it's really important to be really clear as to where that stands. So King's Cross is aligned with the UK GBC framework, and there's a lot of work that's been done recently to define that. So that framework for building performance, and that has really detailed energy use intensities that we'll aim to deliver. The next is data collection, and as we've talked about that quite a lot, but without knowing where we stand, we can't start our journey towards having really targeted building interventions. And we've been doing loads of work over the last 18 months or more to develop a consolidated approach to data capture that gives really granular understanding of carbon performance for each asset, and that will include sort of 15-minute data for the relevant buildings that we want to collect, that we want to improve. And it's only once we've got that information that we can start really with any detail the process of defining our targets and outlining the decarbonisation pathway for the estate as a whole. And we're utilising the support of cost and engineering consultants to help deliver that certainty on a programme for delivery. And from a practicality perspective, again, as we've mentioned already, but these actions also need to align with things like lease events or maybe opportunities to co-invest with tenants if that works. And at King's Cross, we're also factoring in how we decarbonise the heat network and making sure that any planned building interventions align with future technologies that might go into the network. So again, try to put those sort of low or no regret actions as far as we can. I think finally, I say maybe most importantly, but the sort of issue around transparency, the engagement strategy and reporting. So we work very much in partnership with our investors to deliver a robust roadmap to decarbonise the estate with that detailed cost analysis that sits alongside it. And with buy-in from our tenant, without buy-in from our tenants, we won't make that really significant progress on the decarbonisation journey. So that engagement strategy is really critical, to be honest, to really give us any chance of making significant steps forward. And lastly, the reporting piece. So as an industry, I think we need to be sharing data more readily. And King's Cross will publish that performance on an annual basis to see how we're progressing against targets that we've set based on the data we've been collecting. So it's, I think it's time, but yeah, a really whistle-stop view of where we've come, and I think some of the key challenges taking that forward, I think reflects very much what the other sort of presenters have picked up on. But yeah, for now, that's me. Thanks, Thomas.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Rob. So I mean, that now finishes the formal presentation. So I'd encourage everyone to send in their questions, and we've got 15 minutes to answer those. Just quickly before we move on to those, one question for you, Rob. I mean, King's Cross has been, I mean, it's been going for quite a few years now, and I know you had very high sustainability aspirations from the beginning. But are you faced with a situation where the very earliest buildings on the development, you're having to have a look at those and think, we might need to do a bit of retrofitting here, or do they still match up to what you need for net zero?
Yeah, you can kind of see it two ways. So we're in a really fortunate position that it's a relatively young estate. So we don't have, those very early buildings are 10, 12 years old. So while they're BREEAM outstanding of their time, the point at which they were planned and developed and built was probably before we started having this net zero conversation. So, the detailed asset plan for each of the buildings within the estate will vary, and we'll have to start looking, when do the building services come to their end of life position, and when can we look to make those interventions. And I think it's just about having an individual asset plan for each different building on the estate, depending on how they've been designed, when they were built, when they were planned, because you can't treat them all individually. Some are new, some are using historic, some are using sort of heritage type assets. So yeah, there is a balance. And to be honest, the buildings that were built 10, 12 years ago don't have the inherent building fabric that will deliver net zero performance. So we need to think about how we do that over time that is cost effective and practical from a embodied carbon perspective as well as anything else.
Great, well, thanks very much. Nods to the audience, get your questions in. We've got 15 minutes to hear from our experts on your specific challenges. So the first question is, we've seen some stratospheric energy price increases, and in the non-domestic sector, there's no price cap. So for any commercial developers, they're going to feel the full force of these increases. What difference does that make to the economics of decarbonisation? Anyone want to take that? I can't hear you.
Yeah, no, I realised. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, rookie error. Yeah, on mute. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting quandary, because actually what we're seeing is it potentially has a material impact on some, particularly around the decarbonisation of heating, like how that might end up influencing the economic case for change, which potentially is a challenging one. Because of the cost difference between, say, for instance, air source heat pumps and gas boilers. But with the energy prices increasing as they are at the minute, it's moving towards leveling the playing field where maybe it wasn't. But how stable is this volatility? How long does this last? How long do these elevated costs last? And how much reliance could you put on a long-term investment case to justify it? So I think it's I don't know if any others on the panel have got views to add, but I just think it's a really interesting tension that I think still is racked with uncertainty as to how that plays out in the long term.
I think from a government office portfolio, it's kind of helped with my argument that I've always promoted, just as Annabelle said, the whole life asset management versus net present value or return on investment. If anything, this is making my business case is a little bit more sound, and I want to make our assets resilient to volatility in the energy market. And I think that makes a better case for sustainable interventions.
Right,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I was only going to jump in because I think what the rising fuel prices also really drive is that actually we need to reduce our resource use above everything else. So we actually need to reduce our fuel use, our electricity use, even if it is sustainable. We have a limited supply still at the moment, and so everyone needs to reduce. And actually what we're seeing in a global context, driving those energy prices, hopefully what that will do is drive innovation and the delivery of renewable technology within our own nation, so that then we actually get that energy security as well.
And I mean, Annabelle and Stuart, I mean, have you seen any sort of, I don't know, extra interest in the services you're providing given the sudden increases in prices, or is it just staying level?
I think it's definitely a factor. I think, you know, if you look at the residential market and look at fuel poverty, I mean, the increase of fuel prices, you know, in the social housing market and private resi as well, you know, that there has to be a look, and actually that really drives towards decarbonisation and reduced resource use, reduced consumption, which comes from your fabric first approach. And I think, you know, going to Rob's point actually around the finance, you know, we're seeing a huge drive of companies needing to look at their holistic sustainability, their ESG factors, how people stand up in a market where net zero carbon and sustainability is really important to get investment and to deliver work.
And if I can add to it, I think there's an interesting sort of drive emerging, which is at the minute, this has all been rooted to cost. Like, what's the cost of decarbonisation? How much does it cost us? There's never really a value conversation. I think what Miguel and Annabelle have been sort of talking about and sort of alluding to is large parts of decarbonising the built environment it's not just a cost carbon discussion, it's a value one. And some things you just need to pay for. Yeah, over time, hopefully it becomes a cost-effective solution. You can justify it on the economic case alone. But actually, in this transition phase where we are transitioning, a lot of technologies are fairly new. They're not at full scale, not fully commercialized. The price points haven't come down yet, but they will, right? Like we've seen with offshore wind, and we saw the speed at which that happened with the right incentives and the right sort of government support. But actually, it is a conversation of value. And if you think about sort of the wider environmental sort of regulations, legislations, you know, you look at contaminated land assessments, you look at environmental impact assessments and things that need to happen to ensure that developments are done in a sustainable and valuable way. These things aren't, you don't sort of do a cost benefit analysis on doing an EIA. You have to do it because it delivers wider societal value. It ensures that the things we do are done for the benefit of all, right? And I think that's an interesting sort of discussion I think we need to be having more about. While there is a cost discussion to be had, it's got to be a value one as well, particularly in this transition period which we're in. And geopolitically, the volatility of the markets that drive things, that value conversation probably needs to be even louder than it's ever been, I think, for us to advance the outcomes we're seeking, make those outcomes on which we base our investment cases on different, so we can make the better decisions.
I'm afraid I'm going to come back to a cost question again. I totally get your point about value, but I suppose not everyone necessarily is looking at that point of view. I mean, we've got the energy price rises, but we've also got interest rate rises. We've got very high levels of inflation as well, suddenly almost out the blue. How does that affect the business case for decarbonisation?
I'd say what it does. Sorry, what it does is it just highlights the importance of having a clear view of, like, having your data in place and having your view of the cost of decarbonisation well understood, so that you don't make big commitments without understanding what that really means. And actually, when you move into this journey, now that the cost basis are shifting in front of our very eyes and the cost of living is increasing, and to be honest, the pressures that ministers are probably putting others under because of the pressures they're under from constituents, I think it just highlights the importance of having a really solid understanding of the cost of decarbonisation, so you can start to prioritise in light of these challenges, and you can start to reshape your programs and your roadmaps around these sort of ever increasing issues that we see. So I think it just highlights the need for having really robust roadmaps that you can adjust and adapt readily.
Yeah, and for us, it comes down to certainty, and it builds on exactly what Stuart said there. If we know exactly how our buildings are performing, and we know exactly what the interventions are that we need to make, and that will change over time as well. That cost payback, there are some technologies that will have a really relatively decent payback return, and we can calculate that quite quickly. And there are some where we need to take a bit more of a punt and look, can we do a pilot scheme on our other buildings? So we've got an option to do that. So those costs might be increasing to some degree, but I think as is the cost of not doing something. I think it's more important to have that really clear roadmap in place to understand where you want to go and stick to it, I think. But I think the cost of not doing something now is a much bigger risk.
We'll move on to another question about sort of, if you like, hard to treat buildings, listed buildings. Miguel, I think you mentioned in your presentation how there's certain buildings, Whitehall, for example, which are listed, which are very difficult to really retrofit and bring up to zero carbon. And you can kind of offset that by doing some of the easier to treat aspects of your portfolio. I mean, I suppose it's two questions wrapped into one here. Is A, how do you deal with these hard to treat buildings? Is that the right approach? And B, I mean, what happens if you suddenly need to sell off some of your portfolio and you sell off some of your better performing buildings? Then you're left with your balance has kind of gone out of kilter, and then you maybe have to look at those Whitehall buildings again. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a genuine challenge around our legacy buildings in that we have heard from the top of government all the way down that we cannot turn a blind eye to our legacy buildings. They are there, they are part of our heritage, and they are part of the game. They are part of the net zero story. So we have to take those on board as well. Clearly, in meeting our earlier targets, we'll be looking at the low-hanging fruit, and we'll be looking to improve the performance across the whole portfolio to offset the lag of our legacy building. But there comes a point where you'll get towards the end where there's that difficult conversation around, is there potentially a corporate solution to offsetting? Because there are some legacy buildings which will never be net zero. And we need an organizational solution as to how we're going to deal with that delta.
Yeah, I see. Sure. Okay. Just as a quick one, is the Palace of Westminster in your portfolio? Is that something?
It is. It is.
Right. I see. My gosh. I mean, is that going to have any kind of net zero features, or is it just simply a?
So number 10 and Westminster and Whitehall, all of those are part of our net zero program. And on a condition-based analysis, we are prioritizing actions for improvements to those assets.
I see. Right. Okay. I mean, any other thoughts on the panel about sort of hard to treat buildings, and whether they should just be, in terms of funding priorities, we should be leaving those to the very end, or we need to tackle those equally?
I think setting it out as a whole building retrofit is key, whether it's a constrained or an unconstrained building. And where you've got a constrained building, so you're not going to be able to impact a huge amount, and that might be for heritage reasons, visual appearance, it might be part of planning, it might be because you're urban constrained. There are all kinds of different challenges. But I think it's setting out that whole building retrofit, as Miguel said, of what you can do and going as far as possible to reduce your operational energy. And also, in line with the life cycle replacement, making sure you're making those buildings are already built. You've already expended that embodied carbon, so making sure that you do that only in line with your life cycle replacement program. And in terms of the comment around the better buildings balancing out the worst performing buildings, part of that I think comes back to the data point again. And a big part of the Decarbonomics platform at the start is actually in that benchmark stage to look at your whole portfolio and make sure that you don't end up with stranded assets. So if you've got worse performing buildings and you're looking to consolidate your estate, you're selling those ones, you're not renewing the lease on those particular buildings, or looking actually to retrofit them, but understanding that in the first instance so that you don't end up in that position.
Okay. Well, there's quite a few more questions, but actually we're really out of time now. So I'm going to bring the session to a close. And I'd like to thank our panelists and also our listeners for tuning in today. And if anyone wants to hear the session again, this webinar should be available to download. And that's it, mate. Thanks, everybody.